one of the most powerful car brands in the world, is about to face consequences it never saw coming. And the chain of events that led here didn't start with a boardroom decision or a regulatory crackdown. It started quietly, almost insignificantly, with a wrecked car sitting idle in a private garage, a YouTube creator with a camera, and a phone call that should have been routine, but became something else entirely. That call would ripple outward, exposing a system that had operated unchallenged for decades. This is a story of how one company's confidence curdled into arrogance, how that arrogance drew the attention of an entire continent's regulators, and how a law years in the making is now poised to rewrite the rules of car ownership across Europe. At the center of it all was Matt Armstrong, a name well known to anyone who follows the world of automotive rebuilds. His work is simple in concept, but demanding in execution. He finds cars that most people would consider beyond saving, wrecked, written off, abandoned by insurance companies, and he brings them back to life, not behind closed doors, but in full view of millions of viewers who follow every bolt turn and every setback overcome. It's part engineering, part storytelling, and entirely dependent on one thing most people take for granted: access to parts. The car in question was a Bugatti Chiron Super Sport, or what was left of one. It had already been declared a total loss. On paper, it was finished, but to Matt, it was a puzzle worth solving. He approached it the way he always does, methodically, patiently, documenting every step for the audience that had grown to trust his process. He assessed the damage, stripped the car down to its skeleton, cataloged what could be saved and what couldn't. He sourced parts where he could, fabricated solutions where he had to, and slowly, piece by piece, began resurrecting something the world had already given up on. The early stages moved well. His viewers watched the car inch back toward something recognizable. Then he hit a wall. There are moments in every rebuild where improvisation stops working, where you need the exact component, machined to exact tolerances, engineered by the original manufacturer. No aftermarket substitute. No clever workaround. Just the real part from the real source. So he did what anyone in that position would do. He picked up the phone and called Bugatti. The answer he got wasn't technical. It wasn't about lead times or availability or shipping logistics. It was simply no. They refused to sell him the parts. Not because the parts didn't exist. Not because they were backordered. Not because there was a legal prohibition. They refused because they decided, unilaterally, that he shouldn't have them. Here was an experienced rebuilder, working on a car he legally owned, with a documented track record of successful restorations watched by millions, and none of it mattered. Access was denied, not on the basis of capability, but on the basis of principle, their principle. And then something unusual happened. Instead of quietly holding that position and letting the story fade, Bugatti chose to explain itself. Publicly, the company's CEO released a video statement, and it was striking in its tone. He spoke about the Chiron with the precision of an engineer and the protectiveness of a parent. He described the dense network of electrical systems woven throughout the car, the intricate routing of oil, water, and fuel lines that left almost no margin for error, the structural design that essentially requires the vehicle to be split in two for certain repairs. He walked through layers of complexity that most people never consider when they see a hypercar gliding past on a motorway. And in fairness, much of what he said was accurate. The Bugatti Chiron is not an ordinary machine. It is engineered at a level that few vehicles on the planet can match, and the tolerances involved are genuinely unforgiving. But it wasn't the description that caused the problem. It was a conclusion he drew from it. He made it unmistakably clear that a car like this should only ever be touched by Bugatti itself, that only a handful of facilities in the world possessed the necessary equipment, that only a carefully selected group of factory-trained technicians had the knowledge to do the work safely, and by extension, that anyone outside that tightly controlled circle, regardless of their track record, regardless of their skills, simply did not belong anywhere near the car's internals. The message carried a deeper implication, one that extended well beyond Matt's garage. A private workshop, no matter how well equipped, was not enough. Independence, no matter how proven, was not enough. Even legal ownership of the vehicle, it turned out, was not enough to earn the right to repair it. It was a remarkable statement. Confidence, controlled, delivered with the full weight of one of the world's most storied automotive brands behind it, and completely unaware of the firestorm it was about to ignite. Because while Matt's situation was the most visible example, it was far from the only one. Across Europe, thousands of independent mechanics have been running into the same invisible barriers for years. Different brands, different price brackets, but the same frustrating pattern playing out again and again. A customer drives into an independent workshop with a warning light on the dashboard. The mechanic has the training, the tools, the diagnostic instincts built over decades of hands-on work. Everything needed to solve the problem is in that garage except permission. The moment they try to access the vehicle's deeper systems, something blocks them, a proprietary diagnostic port that only pairs with manufacturer-issued software, a part number that returns no results outside the dealer network, a technical bulletin locked behind a login screen that no independent shop can obtain credentials for, or, in the most brazen cases, a manufacturer that simply refuses to sell components to anyone who isn't part of its authorized chain. The outcome is always the same. The repair stalls. The mechanic, despite being entirely capable, has to look the customer in the eye and say there's nothing more they can do. The customer is funneled back to the dealership, back into the system. And inside that system, the landscape changes completely. Prices climb. Wait times stretch from days into weeks, sometimes months. The choice that should exist between competitive options collapses into a single path, dictated entirely by the manufacturer. A family mechanic in Lyon who has kept cars running for 30 years suddenly can't replace a sensor on a modern vehicle because the software to calibrate it exists behind a wall he's not allowed to climb. Brands like Ferrari, Lamborghini, McLaren, and others at the top end of the market had operated this way for decades. But it wasn't only hypercars. Mainstream manufacturers have been tightening the same screws, just more quietly. And it was never presented as a restriction. It was always framed as protection. Protection of quality standards. Protection of engineering integrity. Protection of the customer's safety. Protection, ultimately, of the brand itself. For a long time, that argument carried just enough weight to deflect scrutiny. But pressure has a way of building in silence, and eventually silence breaks. Regulators had been watching. Consumer advocacy groups had been filing reports. Independent trade associations had been compiling data, repair denial rates, parts markup comparisons, warranty and validation patterns. Individually, each complaint looked like a business dispute. Taken together, they formed something far more damning, a systematic pattern of market control disguised as quality assurance. The European Union had already been constructing what would become known as the right to repair directive. It wasn't born overnight. It evolved through years of consultations, committee hearings, industry pushback, and growing public frustration. The legal architecture was being assembled brick by brick, long before Matt Armstrong ever picked up a wrench on that Chiron. What a situation did broadcast to millions, impossible to ignore, perfectly illustrating the core injustice, was to accelerate the timeline and crystallize the argument. It gave an abstract policy debate a human face, a compelling narrative, a clear villain, and an undeniable example of what the legislation was designed to fix. And this law doesn't tinker around the edges of the existing system. It dismantles the foundations. Under the new directive, manufacturers operated within the European Union will no longer be permitted to restrict parts access the way they once did. Spare components must be made available to any qualified repairer who requests them, not just authorized dealers, not just factory-approved service centers. Any properly credentialed professional who can demonstrate the competence to do the work. Diagnostic tools, wiring schematics, calibration software, technical service bulletins, the entire informational ecosystem required to actually repair a modern vehicle must be opened up. Software can no longer serve as a gatekeeper. Proprietary systems can no longer function as moats around manufacturers' revenue stream. And warranties long wielded as the most effective deterrent against independent servicing can no longer be voided simply because an owner chose a different mechanic. For the first time in the history of a European automotive market, independent garages and manufacturer dealerships will compete on something approaching level ground. A mechanic working out of a two-bay workshop in rural Portugal will have the same legal right to order parts and access technical data as a Bugatti-certified facility in Motium. The gap between them will no longer be defined by permission. It will be defined by skill. And skill is something the open market has always known how to reward. The compliance deadline is fixed. July. Meet the requirements, or lose access to the European market entirely. For Bugatti, that threat carries a weight that goes beyond revenue. Europe isn't just another sales region for brand, it's the soil the entire identity grew from. From its founding in Alsace to the mythos built around the Veyron and the Chiron, everything about Bugatti is stitched into European heritage. The craftsmanship, the racing legacy, the artisanal narrative that justifies a price tag measured in millions, all of it draws meaning from that connection. Being locked out of the European market wouldn't just shrink the business. It would sever the brand from the story it tells about itself. And the financial exposure doesn't end with future compliance. Years of operating within a closed system have generated something the company likely never anticipated becoming a liability. A paper trail, every denied parts request, every blocked diagnostic session, every warranty voided because an owner dared to let someone outside the approved network change a gasket or inspect a coolant line. At the time, each was a routine business decision, made within a framework the company controlled completely. But under the new legal standard, those decisions look different. They look like evidence. Evidence of systematic restriction. Evidence of consumer harm. Evidence that the framework itself was designed not to protect quality, but to eliminate competition. And that evidence can now be acted upon. Owners who spent millions on cars they believe were entirely, there's only to discover that the manufacturer is still controlled when, where, and how those cars could be maintained now have legal standing to challenge that arrangement. Mechanics who lost business, who watched qualified work walk out their doors because a manufacturer refused to sell a €50 sensor, now have grounds to seek compensation. Class actions are not theoretical anymore. They are being discussed in law offices across the continent, with case files that grow thicker by the week. The rest of the industry is watching with the kind of attention that borders on anxiety. Companies like Koenigsegg, Pagani, Rimac, every manufacturer that built its business model around tightly controlled ecosystems understands that this isn't about one brand or one rebuilt Chiron. This is structural. This is a ground shifting beneath an entire industry's feet. For decades, the most exclusive car manufacturers in the world operated on an unspoken premise that customers largely accepted without question. You may buy the product, but we retain control. Control over maintenance schedules. Control over who touches a machine. Control over the flow of information needed to understand it. Ownership existed on paper, but in practice, it came with conditions that were rarely spelled out at the point of sale and only discovered when something went wrong. The European Commission has now offered its own interpretation of what those practices represent. Not quality assurance, not brand stewardship, market restriction, plain and clear, the kind of restriction that distorts competition, inflates costs, and strips consumers of choices they were entitled to make. At the heart of this reckoning are the customers themselves, people who handed over sums that could buy homes, who believe that transaction made the car theirs in every meaningful sense, only to learn that access to the machine's own systems was still being rationed. Every service appointment is routed through a single network. Every repair depends on a single supply chain with a single pricing structure. Every decision about the car's future filtered through an authority the owner never elected and couldn't overrule. That was never really ownership. It was a leasing arrangement dressed in the language of luxury. The new directive rewrites that contract. It gives owners rights they should have had from the moment they signed the purchase agreement. The right to full transparency about their vehicle's technical requirements. The right to choose who performs the work. The right to access every part and every piece of information needed to keep their property functional. And critically, the right to challenge any manufacturer that tries to circumvent those protections. Some owners will exercise those rights quietly, simply by choosing a local mechanic for the first time. Others will exercise them in court. Either way, the balance of power has shifted, and it isn't shifting back. What happens next depends on how the industry responds. Companies like Bugatti can adapt. They can open their parts catalogs, share their diagnostic platforms, compete on the quality of their service rather than the exclusivity of their access. They can treat the directive not as a threat, but as an opportunity to prove that their expertise genuinely is superior, not because it's the only option, but because it's the best one. That would be the smart play, the resilient play, or they can resist, delay compliance, test enforcement, lobby for exceptions, and in doing so, risk becoming the cautionary tale that regulators hold up every time they need to justify the law's existence. Because regulators don't just write rules. They look for examples. And the most visible offender always makes the most effective one. Matt Armstrong picked up a phone and asked for parts to fix a car he owned. He was told no. That refusal, amplified by millions of viewers and validated by the experiences of thousands of professionals across Europe, became something its authors never intended. It became a catalyst. The European Union didn't make a phone call. It rewrote the system. The deadline is approaching, and the architecture that kept independent builders locked out is being taken apart, not gradually, not in phases, but comprehensively. Parts that were hoarded behind dealer networks will flow into the open market. Diagnostic tools that were treated as trade secrets will become accessible to any qualified hand. Choices that never existed for owners and mechanics alike will become standard, protected not by goodwill, but by law. For independent mechanics, this is a door opening onto work they were always capable of doing. For owners, this is a moment their purchase agreement finally means what they thought it meant. For manufacturers, this is a reckoning decades in the making. Bugatti built its empire on exclusivity, on control, on the carefully maintained idea that access itself was part of the product, something to be earned, granted, and revoked at the company's discretion. Now, across an entire continent, access is becoming a right, codified, enforceable, and